This is the third webinar in the 2025 series presented by the Society of Product Safety Professionals. As always, we want to thank Sedgwick Brand Protection for sponsoring these webinars. And we appreciate the fact that they sponsored them last year and this year. My name is Ken Ross. I'm the webinar coordinator. And I'll be speaking a little bit at the beginning of this program and then introduce our main speakers. Today's topic involves a very interesting issue that I've struggled with for decades, and that is the use of foreign language either in products we sell in the US or products that we sell internationally. And there's some interesting issues. I'm going to give a really short discussion about current law in that area, and then I'll turn it over to Trish and Aaron, who will talk about how you translate into foreign languages wherever you need to do that, and how to structure instructional material and other material, such as warnings, with multiple languages, and what are the effective ways of doing that. So that's our topic today. Now, before I get to that, let me just have a new chart here of webinars we'll be doing after today. In March, we'll be talking about manufacturers and retailers issues, which we did last year, but I've got two new retailers to talk about their views of some of these things. I've got a CPSC trial attorney who's going to talk about reporting issues and developing a corrective action plan. And that should be very interesting. And I appreciate the CPSC offering their speaker to talk about this issue. In May, we're going to talk about managing cross-border recalls and multiple country recalls, which is very tricky, particularly if you sell in lots of countries, of course. And then in June, we're going to talk about an issue that's very interesting to me and very tricky, and that is, when can you offer optional safety? And what do you do when you make a safety improvement in the product? And what are your responsibilities to do about that? And I do have a patent lawyer who's going to talk about how patents get involved in product liability litigation and how to consider patents as you are designing products and making product safety improvements. Here are our speakers for today. Trish Stewart is at TerraLingua Translations. Aaron Murray is the head of customer engagement and product at Ken Cook Company, which is a company that specializes in developing instructional material. And these two are true experts in this area, and I'm so pleased that they have agreed to participate today, and I want to thank them. So, where are translations important? It's not what we normally think of as the first bullet, and that is instructions and warnings that accompany the finished product sold to the customer in the US or internationally. And we'll talk about in the US because we also have to talk about multilingual information in the US and when it's appropriate. Similarly, online product information supplied by the OEM in their website and a retailer's website. That's where it could be you could have English and you could have other languages in that in your website where you present that. Advertising and marketing material. And we'll talk about that in a second in connection with some of the legal cases. And then the last thing, which we don't normally talk about, but this can be very important too, and that is the technical documents you as an OEM, for example, or a component part supplier, whichever, are generating or receive from people who you buy from. So I'm a US company. I buy safety critical component parts from a Chinese company, and their documents are all in Chinese. Do I get them translated? Can I read them? Do I understand them? Do I request that they be translated? And who does the translations? So the technical documentation can be very, very important. Certainly instructions, and many times when we do this, instructions are converted from Chinese into English by the Chinese manufacturer, and it winds up a little off, to say the least. So how do you deal with those kinds of things when somebody else is doing the translation, but the translation is not very good? So I've spent 35 years reviewing manuals, mostly from Japan, and trying to understand what they're saying. And it's usually written by Japanese nationals and then translated by them into English, and the English translation is not very good. So that can be very important when you then, as an OEM, trying to incorporate that information into your instructions. Similarly, foreign component suppliers will send instructions that you're supposed to include in your instructions, or including in technical documentation, testing reports, things like that. So translations go from both the OEM to the consumers, sometimes from the consumers to the OEM, and they can be in foreign languages, or also from the component part manufacturer to the OEM. Now, this is important for both safety and the CPSC and in product liability litigation. So when you file a 15B and start a corrective action with the CPSC, they may want to get the test reports from the foreign manufacturer, and they're all in a foreign language. So, can they make you translate them? Do you have to translate them? Do you really need to see that before you make the filing? So a lot of translation issues that go well beyond just the instructions and warnings, which will be the main focus of our talk today, though. Now, the law is not very clear, and there have been not that many cases on it, but you can read these later. But there are very few federal or state laws that require warnings in any language other than English. The CPSC has a few, and it's only on products where they've had a bunch of accidents involving non-English speaking people. Now there was the warnings, not the instructions necessarily, where they came out with a standard that required a warnings on the packaging in Spanish. So generally speaking, there's no duty to provide a warning in any other language for a product sold in the US other than English, unless there are federal laws on that. But there are some exceptions to it, which I'll get into in the next slide. So warnings in a language other than English may be necessary. I'm going to read the sentence because it says it right there, where it is reasonably foreseeable that non-English speakers will use the product. And in particular, the cases that have come down have been where the manufacturer or the retailer advertised in Spanish in a local area, usually in Southern California, near Mexico, in San Diego, or it was in Southern Florida. So the manufacturer or the retailer advertised in Spanish. The warnings and instructions were not in Spanish. They were only in English. Somebody gets hurt, they say we didn't understand, and they sued. So the court didn't really hold that they had to have Spanish, but they were saying, yeah, it might have been a good idea. So if you advertise in a local Spanish language media and Spanish speakers are going to read, you want them to read the warnings and instructions, it might be a good idea to have Spanish in there. So it's kind of it's hard to know what other courts might say the same thing, and they didn't say clearly that you had to, just that it might be a good idea. But the plaintiff has the burden to show that the manufacturer should have reasonably foreseen that no one read English down there. And the last one is that some courts have said that if reasonably foreseeable users are illiterate or do not read English, and the label does not have pictograms or text that are readily understood by such users, that they might be liable. They didn't hold that they were liable, just they were kind of musing about it in the opinion. And that case involved migrant farm workers in southern Texas who would cross the border every day to work with chemicals, and the labeling on the chemical containers were only in English, and they had no pictograms. So there we're talking about both translating in foreign languages and also the use of pictograms, which is another interesting issue. So couple of things. And by the way, I'm going to be posting an article that I've written on this subject, which goes into a lot more detail. This is just a quick overview before we get to Trish and Aaron. So you got to be very careful before you put any foreign languages on any of your products in the US. Now, a lot of companies have been doing French, English, Spanish because of NAFTA, and they figure that'll help them for both, all of North America. So they just kind of give up and don't worry about it because products, can flow generally freely between the three countries. At least it used to be that way. So you want to be careful about it, though. Some companies have English, Spanish warning labels, but the manuals are in English. To me, that doesn't make any sense. If you're going to start putting a foreign language on there, then you got to worry about whether your instructions also have to have that foreign language. And then sometimes you put foreign languages both in the manual, and Aaron and Trish are going to talk about this. So you get multi-languages in the manuals and on the warnings, and it's impossible to find the English in there. It's very hard to find it unless you're formatting it in a good way. So you don't want to make your English information deficient and defective by putting foreign languages in there. So you've got to be careful about that you don't. I like the word conspicuity. I think it is a real word. So you don't want to diminish the conspicuousness of the English labels. Now, if you have an employment situation, you can always ask the customer, do they want languages other than English for their employees? I did a project one time for a laundry equipment manufacturers, and some customers wanted warning labels in Spanish, and some wanted the warning labels in Korean. So just putting English and Spanish in the US doesn't make sense necessarily. It depends on where the products are being used. So sometimes if we have the ability to talk to the people who are using our products, we try to find out what language they speak other than English. Um, Sometimes pictorials can be used instead of words, but some companies want to put pictorials only on their warning labels, and that's all. And us lawyers think that that's not a good idea because you can't transmit all the information in pictorials. You've got to have words. So it's really a combination of pictorials and words in most areas there, and not just the pictorials themselves. Um, and there's an ability to use your website to offer English on the information you submit and then have the foreign language information on the website. And you have a link to take them there. So if they need Spanish or Korean or French or German or whatever, they can find it on your website. Yeah, I think I already talked about that. Some courts have encouraged use of pictorials. All right. And the last two slides, which you can read later, the EU has got some various laws and directives about foreign languages. You can look at that. You don't make machinery, so don't worry about the machinery directive, but they're starting to talk about it. This is an ISO standard that talks about the use of foreign languages and how to do layouts in Europe. So, and the product liability directive passed by the EU does talk about inadequate warnings and instructions. So the law is fairly similar from the US and Europe, and that is if you don't adequately inform the user of the product in the language that they read and speak, your product might be considered deficient. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn it over to Trish, who's going to start her presentation, and Aaron, and submit questions, and we'll either try to ask them while they're talking, or we'll save them till the end. I'll monitor your questions for you.
Whoops, I just went to the back there. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you, Ken, for having us. I definitely appreciate this opportunity to share with you some best practices. Ken is an amazing resource, and I'm very proud to be called upon to share some best practices along with Aaron Murray from Ken Cook. Um, I think that there is so much that is just like what Ken says oftentimes. It depends. It depends on your audience. It depends upon your needs. So that's why Aaron and I are going to share some best practices. But we welcome your questions. There's a question and answer box down at the bottom that Ken will be monitoring. And if you have any questions that come up that are particular to you, and again, I'm sure that Ken probably puts out this disclaimer too, in that this is just some industry recommendations, but you should always consult your company guidelines, your legal consultant, your trusted advisors. But we're always happy to be here as a resource. So we want to share some best practices with you today and help you have better outcomes. Aaron, did you have any thoughts about any of that?
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the things that Ken did say that always is a word that I'm not a big fan of is the term expert. I've been working in technical communications for quite some time, and Trish, I know you as well with translation. At the end of the day, we are here to help guide you to make things better, to make things more efficient, to make things more cost effective too, as well as one of the goals, obviously, for us as well. So the term expert, we're always learning ourselves on a regular basis. So we're always willing to take feedback or hear from you as well. So anytime you have questions or things that we're talking about here, and you have an idea or something that maybe we didn't think about, we would love to hear that as well. Other than that, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we just have some basic slides. Like Ken said, we'll be sharing these later. We're not going to just read off of all the slides. But if you would like us to pause and spend more time on any of the slides or again, have any questions, just use that box at the bottom. So we're going to begin and end with a focus on questions. And the questions that I first would like you to think about, how are you, how are you currently handling your current translation process or your formatting process? How are you currently handling your materials? And think about the bias or the experience of the people that are involved in the process. And so what protocols do you have in place to ensure the best outcome? And who can you call upon for the best advice? And again, going back to the bias, your distributor or your people may have a different bias or a different viewpoint. And so always keep that in mind whenever you're looking at, there is no one way to do anything. And so always look at what is going to help me produce the best possible outcome and who can I call upon. So it's not just the people that you pay to do the things. Organizations such as this, networking, talking to other people in your role. Sometimes you can get the best ideas and feedback if you're able to utilize societies and professional organizations like this one to interact with others who have the same pain points that you might have in your job. But always remember the amount of time that it took you to create the source documentation. Please allow for that same amount of time whenever you do your another language or another version. It's not just a matter of spitting out it in another version. You have to think of many different aspects, such as the localization or the considerations for that that software, that platform that you might be using. Aaron, do you
Yeah.
have any thoughts
Yeah.
about any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to think about like the formatting. So words going to be longer or in a different way or a different term or different phrase, and even the regional specific area as well, which I know we'll get into more as well. It's important to make sure you think about this. It's not going to be a snap. This word translates this word. It's all the different pieces that go along with it and how you're going to make sure it's flowing still properly for that organization. So there's a lot of different moving pieces when you do translation, not just simply in digital documentation, but also in other places that are not just simply in a PDF or something like that that you're going to publish or print, but something that nowadays video assets or website or things like that where you're going to put these other translated pieces as well.
And just always remember, no matter how many times you look at something, there's always something that you want to tweak. I'm looking at this right now and I'm like, that should be whom, right? Whom am I? So, you always have little tweaks and things, even in the source native language that you have. So consider that with the target languages that there are always tweaks and improvements that you can make to things. So going into translation, we'll just start off with that. Just like Ken said, whether it's in the US or globally, you always want to think about pictorials are wonderful, but if you've ever tried to assemble IKEA furniture, you know the pain of not having the supporting words. Though there are industry standards, Ken mentioned, there are databases, there are different things that you can call upon, but always having that supplementary text is always helpful to avoid any kind of confusion and ensure that you're in compliance with whatever import rules there may be. Ken, do you have some thoughts about
Yeah,
that?
I wanted to give an example here. There are cultural differences about pictograms. So the way we portray safety or lack of safety in the US is very different than the way they do it in the EU and Europe. They're much more graphic in Europe. And similarly, they're much different in Asia. In Asia, they like to use cartoon-like figures of human beings to show safety and lack of safety. So you really have to consider the culture, which is one of the reasons why the use of pictorials for worldwide sales in my mind, doesn't work because because we got different cultures and the way they interpret these things can be very different. So now that's not necessarily you guys deal with the pictorials necessarily, but you got to be sure that those things and the words you're using are specific to that region where you're talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, Ken, but isn't that really just the idea of regionalization is the biggest thing to talk about? Because I think because I lived overseas, I worked in Singapore for a few years and I had to do a lot, quite a bit in China. And I did see quite a few in Asia, the different types of graphics that were over there. And to be honest, I actually think they're great in what they actually give out. And because it's dialect specific, like even in China, there may be 10 different dialects within an area. Those pictorials may be perfect for that regional specific area, but now isn't going to work in Europe or isn't going to work in America. So, I mean, the truth is, like everything you're putting out there may be beneficial. It's just make sure you're regionally making it specific, like the words, the terms, but pictorial is the same way. It's just simply another way of translating, isn't it?
It is, and the localization process, but you also can get into trouble in that if you're trying to make things specific for all of the regions, then you could make an insane amount of content and materials that you then have to update and maintain and ensure that you're always, keeping it current. So there are pros and cons to both considerations. Just like, for example, with French, I've had clients who ask, do I really need to have, I already have this in European French. Do I really need to do this again for
Maybe.
Canada? Well,
Yeah.
as Ken and I often joke about, it depends, right? It depends upon, you could have just an edit. You may not need to do a whole new translation, but just review it for that regional consideration, see if there are any modifications that need to be made. But oftentimes, if you consult your legal consultant, they may say, for the import, they just require French. And so the European's fine. But your end user may want some regional differences applied that make sense to them because we can tell, even with English, if something was for the UK versus for the US, we might say lift. We don't say lift, we say elevator or whatever it might be. So it's just, I know that it's a lot sometimes to think about, but having that considerate evaluation of things before you send it off for a translation and looking at the terms that you use and thinking, could we do this with with an image or with something instead of just text? What kind of ambiguity might there be? So that's where things like STE might come in, simplified technical English. And some people think, well, I apply STE. And so therefore, I'm avoiding any kind of misunderstandings. But as Aaron mentioned with the regional differences, that can also, it depends on the type of material that you have, whether it's marketing or technical or whatever it might be.
Yeah,
Ken?
also your audience matters
Oh,
then too. It's may not be just simply regional, but it's also who is the person that's going to be utilizing that material, who's the person that's going to be getting behind that piece of equipment, or who's reading that specific thing to then diverse that information or just distribute that information to other people as well. So it's not just simply the regionalization, it's also who is the actual audience can make that difference in that specific function. So if you are selling into Canada, but let's say Canada is your big market and that's the place where a lot of people are going to be utilizing your stuff, it would probably make sense then to make sure that it is going to be French Canadian to fit for those specific regions. There's a lot of different moving pieces here for that. So we'll get a little more into STE and things like that. I'm not against it. I'm not for it though. At the same time, as a teacher and an educator, because the problem with it with STE is that it really is designed for universally keeping it simple and keeping it clean, but it doesn't always work really well when you're trying to educate people. So on the training side of things, it doesn't always work.
Well, and you will have a slide on STE. We haven't even gotten to that yet, so
Yeah.
I'm not sure if they know that acronym. Let me just throw in one thing here too. Within the US, even if we're just communicating in English, we need to consider who our foreseeable users are and what their reading level is. And what kinds of words would they understand or not
Yeah.
understand?
Who's the
And
audience?
certainly that goes right into the translation and has to consider that too. And there may be different countries that have different reading. I mean, I don't think there's
Literacy. Yeah.
equivalent reading levels. You can't do it from country to country. So you really have to talk to locals, I think, probably try to figure out what your foreseeable users, what words they understand or don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually one of the reasons I love pictorials, actually, and why I like pictographs, is because unfortunately, a lot of people out there in different parts of the countries that are, I spent a lot of time throughout Southeast Asia, and the people didn't know how to read. So in certain areas, so like people that were in Cambodia, they didn't even know how to read their local language a lot of times for stuff. So how do you then give that information in that specific area? By the way, this is not a statement that people in Cambodia can't read. This is just simply stating some of the people I was talking to did not have
For
literacy,
that
didn't have
audience,
that at all.
right?
So it's just simply the pictorials were a great way to then give them that information for them to understand, then train those people to those specific topics. Just to give an
Right.
example.
So as you can see, we can really get into the weeds with all of this, and we're already almost a half an hour into this. So
Sorry.
we'll try to go more high level with things, but there are some best practices that we definitely can implement. And again, if you've never heard of STE, Simplified Technical English, here's a basic overview of what it is. It follows a specific rule set for writing technical documentation. I'm sure you've probably heard of it before, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but here's some examples of some warnings that were revised according to STE rules. So, like Erin said, it's very dependent upon the, like for training, it may not work so great, but for other things, it may be a better way to ensure that you don't have misunderstandings. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Wendy Canal, who is probably one of the greatest, speaking of instructors with STE. And so if you ever need a good resource with STE, if that's something that you want to explore, I'd be happy to share, like Ken said, some resources that may help you with that. But whether it's safety messages or something more with training, and like Erin mentioned, we want to think about, who is the end user and how may they understand this content? How can we apply some best practices to ensure they understand this content? Um, Guys, feel free to hop in at any time, but I'll just keep kind of going through. But as we mentioned before, when Ken started off with, in Puerto Rico, there may be some instructions that you may want to do, but will that be understood in other Spanish speaking areas as well? And one of these verbs that was highlighted there in different areas, it may have more of a connotation that you may not want to have. So that in Europe has one connotation or one definition or one thing, but in another region, it has more of a sexual kind of inference. So you want to make sure that even though something is in Spanish, that it's appropriate for all of your end users. And that's why sometimes people go for an international Spanish, which is more of a generic type of Spanish. And you'll see some of the ISO codes over here for the different Spanish targets that you may have. And so whenever your translation partner creates a database called a translation memory, that you will see an abbreviation after it, or they should have an abbreviation after it showing what the specific target was for that language. If there are, like Erin said, is it, traditional Chinese or simplified Chinese? Is it French for Canada or French for Europe? And so those specific things are included whenever your language service provider creates the asset for you. Those are all things that they consider. But you also want to think about the measurement units and how it may differ between different regions. Erin, Ken, any thoughts? We're just going to keep moving on.
I mean, yeah, you can keep moving on specifically. I mean, the
Yeah.
stuff that we're doing from a translation standpoint, what you're talking about, you're the person I go to for those kind of questions and stuff. So you would know more than I would here.
Well, and so whenever we were talking about the end user, what helps you ensure that you're creating documentation that everyone understands is for the end user is to set up a style guide or to set up your terminology that you want to use. So even though your people in the field aren't the ones who are doing the translation, to get their feedback as to how do we call things for our company? What is most familiar to you? And getting that feedback and implementing it in some kind of foundational document. So then that way, all people who localize or translate any of your material understand your company guidelines and what's required, whether it's what items do we not translate? What are some brand type of words that we don't want to translate? That sort of thing. And
It's
as I
also
mentioned,
words that are like invented, like theoretically, like when the internet was first invented, as an example, they had to, like in China, they had to invent multiple different words, to merge together to create that term. So I mean, isn't that same kind of idea? Is like, so if you've invented or a term or a word or a brand that goes along with that would go along with that terminology? Is that correct?
yes. So if you, so that is whenever you, for example, and we'll get into that with did I go? Maybe whenever we were on regionalization, I could go back there. But oftentimes with brands, you may want to create a localized brand name for a product or for even your company. And so you can kind of transliterate, make up, have the same kind of meaning inside of a word if you would like to have. But that's a different process where you would really have to work with your marketing people and ensure that your brand is properly represented. That's not something that you just want to turn over to a translation provider. The translation provider can provide you with some options, but that definitely is something that you want to spend a lot of time with your in-house people to make sure that you're not creating something that's a little too strange. Like I'm sure we've all heard about all of the awful, Nova and all the things, meaning no go, whenever they translated it, to another market. But your translation provider creates a database, and many people don't know about this. And I talk about it a lot. And if you've ever heard me talk about it, I apologize because I talk about it frequently because people aren't aware of it because they don't have the tool that creates it, so they can't open it. But if your translation provider shares this asset with you, you can leverage that little suitcase or a database across any of your offices or with any provider that you may choose to use. And what that is it's a database that a translator will open up, and it aligns the English and the target language, and it allows reuse, and it allows consistency, which is very important in regards to safety and liability. You want to make sure that your end user is always seeing the content the same way. But I know that sometimes people say, I just want it translated. I don't really care about all of these details. But the important thing is let's say you have a translation provider who knows all of your jargon, has set up all of these style guides and glossaries, and then something happens where they're bought out by someone else, or maybe they, don't make it financially, and then your asset is gone and you have no, you still have your translated content, but the ability to quickly reuse and repurpose and quote unquote, I know we love this word pivot, to turn it over to someone else without losing anything, because it takes a lot of time for someone to cull through all of your documentation to see what do they call things? What is their style like? What is the reading level? It takes a lot of work. And so if you have control of your assets, your translation memory, your style guide, your glossary from your provider, always keep a copy of it because you never know. It's kind of like being in an emergency, right? We don't know if we're going to need our birth certificate, but it's always good to have a copy of it someplace else. And that applies to this as well because people spend a lot of money on translation or they spend a lot of time, and you want to make sure that you have the continuation of care. Did you have any thoughts about that, Aaron or Ken, or are there any questions that have come up?
I mean, this is something you've been preaching to me since we've met. So this is something that obviously I pay attention to pretty heavily. Also being in some of the space of machine learning and things like that, this data is actually valuable outside of just simply with a partner or somebody else like that. These can be used to help train models and things like that as well, to help you as you start building internal chatbots or internal LLMs as well.
Exactly, which is why probably, and not to make it sound like your LSP, your localization service provider, is hiding anything from you. It just doesn't serve them to share this with you because, as Aaron said, you can use it to help train, the LLM, or to help you leverage your content in a way that it's important. Knowledge is power. And so if you know to ask for this, if you know that you have this asset living somewhere where you don't have to create it yourself, it's very powerful. And Lee asks about having the option of modifying the original language. Yes, you do. Of course, it's always good to know ahead of time whenever you first start out, because I've had clients who start off, oh, we want Mexican Spanish. No, no, we want Latin American Spanish. No, no, we want European Spanish. And so they have all of these different databases and translation memories, but you can consolidate them and you can resolve any conflicts and make it into one memory. The only caveat is that if you've spent a lot of time developing a database and then you need to merge it into a new one, there is a cost to evaluate and go through and clean up terms and make sure that everything is all consistent. And that's
So,
also true. Oh, go ahead, Aaron.
sorry, I was just going to say that's just simply true with any data, right? That's not just
Right.
translation. That's just making sure your data is clean. And you can, if you start porting over bad data into different things, and same, I assume, with translation work would also be the same idea and issue. So yeah, making sure you always keep it clean is super important. That's all. Sorry.
Oh no, that's great, Aaron. And then also too, if you would switch from one provider to a different provider, it doesn't hurt to have them look at the memory first before they start implementing it, just because, especially if you've left someone because you weren't happy with the quality, you may not want to use that translation memory at all. Or you may want to evaluate, do we want to try to edit it and clean it up with certain terms? So, you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but you also don't want to bring in errors that you wouldn't want to continue. So how translation memory also matters is that you can reuse and repurpose that content, not just for consistency's sake, so that way your user always experiences the same verbiage and always has the same message, but also in that it saves you money. So you can see here, for example, Spanish, instead of being evaluated at 13 cents per word, can go down to like 4 cents a word, which basically is just covering the editing. And this is for an all human process. If you would go to machine translation, that could go even lower. It's always an interesting asset to be able to leverage, because you might be comparing quotes, but the quotes may not be completely
Apples to apples.
accurate, right? So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but please know if you ever have any questions about translation memory, come see me. I will talk your ear off all day about it, right, Aaron?
Yep.
So yes, Alan brought up
But
the
to be honest, that being
realization.
said, Trish, like we've at Ken Cook, we've used multiple different translation partners and different companies over the years and stuff like that. Because of the things you've taught us over the years, it's saved us a ton of money for not just us, but for our customer base as well. So yeah,
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Aaron. I did not pay you to say that either.
you
So
did not. No.
Uh, but that's also something important to consider is how your resources can work together. So, we have a great partnership, Aaron and I do, but think about, how can you introduce your resources to each other so that way they can ensure your asset is being managed in the best possible way. So going to selecting a translation process, there are many different ways that you can do it, and pros and cons to all of them. But if you'd like to discuss any of the pros and cons for any of these different ways of doing things, more than happy to get into it. But the most important thing for you to think about is what is overseeing the quality control? Because as Ken said, you have to look at the burden of, what do we do? Do we just pull in some guy, off the street who knows Spanish, or did we actually prove that we used a subject matter who knew this content, who was going to produce a message that really spoke to the end user to ensure? And this is really important, especially if you have something that could cause death or severe injury to someone. You really want to make sure that you have something standing behind why you chose the person that you did.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I speak to this just a second, real quick?
sure, yes,
Just even
please.
that, because we work with quite a few different companies. They're all over the place in different places. And I'll give an example of this company that was in Italy. And they're like, oh, we're just going to use one of our vendors that's in Italy to do this translation for us in this specific way. We're like, great. If that's who you want to use, we'll help you out when it's done and get things, formatted and put it together properly. We came back and I'm Italian, but like I don't speak anything whatsoever, but my mom does. So my mom took a look at some of the stuff and she's like, what is the words here? What does this mean? Like, and she was confused by some of the terms and stuff. It turns out that vendor over there, yeah, they knew Italian, but they didn't really know Italian the proper way and the terms. We then sent it over to a translation partner to take a look at this and see what this would actually look like. And we found out that a lot of the terms, the words they were using were not technical, weren't in the actual terms they were using. And the person knew Italian, but they were actually a Spanish speaking person that just knew Italian really well and didn't do a good job of it. So you got to be careful about, like, if you have somebody you trust that may have done it, and maybe it's cheap and easy, but it's important to make sure you actually have a quality, especially when it comes to safety. I can't preach that enough. In this specific case, I'm sure we've saved them lawsuits in the future from that.
Can I give an example of that?
Yes, please.
I did work for a cell phone manufacturer, and we were getting reports from the field about fires involving cell phones in Japan. And we looked into it, and it turned out that the way the Japanese accident reports were being translated, it was not a fire, but the translator, who was probably just some employee in the office, was translating accident reports, mistranslated it, and everything looked like fire. It translated one word, wasn't fire, into fire. So yeah, you gotta be really careful that people know what they're doing and know how to translate these things, because it can have ramifications for in a lot of areas.
Right. And it's not to say that you can't use your in-house people or your distributors or your people in the field. It's just applying some good practices over it. Maybe you just hire a subject matter expert to go over it and edit it and make sure that it's okay. You don't necessarily have to go all in, with the language service provider, though it does cover your behind quite well because, usually you're going to select a language service provider who is going to have errors and omissions insurance, who's going to have protocols in place such as these categories for quality control are based on LISA, the Localization Industry Standards Association. And every translation that we do goes through checking these 10 categories before it goes out and is scored and remedied. And then how you can ensure that they have a good process in place is to look for some of these certifications. So we know about the 9001, but the 17100 tells you that they're using an all human native speaker, subject matter expert. They're audited for these things. So the auditor is going to come in and check to see the CVs of the people who worked on a project. And you're going to, they have to put their money where their mouth is if they have that credential. And then the 18587 is for machine translation with a subject matter expert edit after the machine translation. And then something that's also helpful too to kind of cover yourself is to ask your provider, especially if it's something highly sensitive, is to provide you with a letter of some sort saying that, this was translated by a professional subject matter expert, and that sort of thing. So that way, should there ever be a concern, you have that to show, hey, I was told by the CEO of this company that this was completed by a professional person. So,
Let me just point out this. So
yeah.
we've been answering questions as they come in. So I normally leave time at the end for questions, but we've been answering them, and Trish has got more slides. So Trish, you got 15 minutes to get through all your slides.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. And Aaron, I have been talking way too much, so please feel free to hop in at any time. But I'll go a little more quickly here in that you also have to think about the security considerations, especially if you have anything that's going to be sold to the government. E-Verify needs to be used to ensure that the translator who's working on things, it has the correct clearance and the right working protocol to work on things. Won't go into that too much, but always think about that. But I'll be quiet now, and Aaron, I'll let you talk about, if you'd like to, about formatting considerations, or I can keep going and you can hop in.
I mean,
Whatever
you
you
can keep going for, I mean, from when it
Okay.
comes to the translation piece, if you want me to go into more of the technology or the flow from a training standpoint, I can,
Yeah.
I mean, I know those are later slides. I can go really into detail. And I mean, when it comes to the AI stuff of it, I can really, I mean, I even have functional examples I can even show if people want to see and that kind of stuff as well. So it all depends on, I guess, the audience with the time we have left, what we would like to go over. When it
Okay,
comes to
I'm going to
formatting,
go
we've kind of
quickly.
talked about this the entire time,
Yeah.
in this specific way. I guess is the question is that what would people like to hear from the last 15 minutes we have?
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry. I guess, Ken, do you see anything here? All the questions. Okay, yes, let's talk AI, says somebody. So you'll have these screens to talk about best practices whenever you're doing multi-language. You know, there's expansion, there's contraction, there's that sort of thing. So there will be, measurement, units of measurement. If you're exporting, trade.gov is a great resource. But Aaron, I'll let you talk AI,
Sure.
and
So,
you all will have these slides later on
sure.
to review in regards to other best practices you can implement.
So I will state very clearly that when it comes to AI, I would not use it for your safety and security functions at this current time, unless you've trained a model over the past couple of years where you've given it the amount of information that where you're using the translation memory, you're giving, and you have a model that's just really up to speed that you're using internally. If you're using ChatGPT or if you're using, those are not the tools to be using for this stuff at this current time. It is not set and ready yet at this time for us to just simply universally translate, or else Google Translate would be at a point where that could really take over a lot of that stuff. I will say it has gotten substantially better over the last couple of years. It is getting better and better. And the places that I am using it are in places like in social media, in places that are not really in the safety messaging of it. So I would strongly recommend you still utilize people like Trish, like TerraLingua, or a partner that you can trust to make sure that the quality of that stuff comes out. When it comes to the AI functions of it, there's tons of amazing tools out there that can literally do stuff in seconds nowadays. Would it be okay if I shared my screen and took off the, is that an option? Am I allowed to do that?
Yes, you can, Aaron. I believe you can share your screen.
Give me 1 second.
But
It is not letting me share.
it's not letting you share.
Maybe let's try it again.
What happened to oh, there we go. Is it there?
Is it there? Can everybody see my screen? Or Trish, can
Yeah,
you
I see a screen. Yeah. Is that
Yes, that's you, Aaron. Yes.
So this is just an example of some of the tools you can use nowadays. And this is a tool called SmartCat. There is literally tons of different tools that I use from training and education pieces. This is Cab AI. This is SmartCat. This is a very cool tool. What it allows you to do is you take a video that you've basically uploaded. So I'm going to play this video real quick. That I'll be using for social media. And it's now playing out essentially this video. And what you can simply do is you go over to the translation button. So you just upload it to take seconds. You hit the translation button, then you can type out what language you want. So in this specific sense, I want Spanish. And literally in seconds, it just translated it over for those functions. Now, it does a pretty good job here. Now, the key for me is that a lot of our customers are in other countries. So I'm creating social media. A lot of my assets are built all the time. I rebuild them all in Spanish, almost everything, so that people can hear it and see it and that kind of stuff as well. And it's now done it, I would say, with about 90% accuracy for the stuff I'm talking about here. Very basic. I don't know if the audio is coming through, so my apologies if it doesn't come through. ¿Y qué voy a hacer con ello? Lo voy a usar para traducir a diferentes idiomas. No siempre uso IA para traducir. So it's the same exact content just absolutely just translate it over. Now, what we talked about before with formatting, it is not, it will, things like some of the words and terms that I said here are going to have different frames, different amounts. So the video does need to be tweaked and modified a little bit. So it is important to know that you still have to do some work regarding the stretch out or the strengthening of the videos, some things like this. But as you can see, within seconds and for pennies, literally this cost about probably 40 cents for me to have this automatically clipped over, translated with a voiceover artist on it in AI. Pretty straightforward. This stuff is out there. It's available today, and I do recommend it for non-safety functions. And I can't say that enough. For non-safety functions, the stuff that's out there is quite good. Even in Zoom, there's actually an AI tool set where you can have it so it'll translate or do voiceover in that specific language. It is getting better and better every day. I can't imagine that we're not going to be there in the very short period of time, to be able to make this so that other tools or other things within the next few years where these things are just more up to date. I mean, that's kind of a high level idea or concept to give some thoughts of what you can do from an AI standpoint. But as a person who runs an internal LLM, so we have our internal tool that we built here. And then I have trained it with language tools with way more than just that, but it's also using our terminology, our words, our verbiage, things for ANSI standards, things like that. So I'm asking it to do a lot more than just simply translate. Translation is actually a tiny piece of what we're asking it to do. It's important to make sure that you are utilizing that information and making sure that it is valid. So in all honesty, every single project that we still have that goes out, that's going out to a customer, none of it is touching that AI at this current time. It is all under the training model that we're currently doing. And then we're still using partners like Terralingua to do all of that work to make sure that it's at the highest quality and at that safety standard that we're all used to at this current time. But it doesn't mean that in a few years, we're not unfortunately going to be there. We're at a point where we have our own internal tools, but you got to start training those tools now. That's the key.
Right. And training the tools with your translation memory is very helpful. And having a great partner like Ken Cook, who is able to utilize the tools in the best way. We do use AI. So as Aaron was saying, with the voiceover work, it used to be you had to have a specific voice talent, wait for them to be available, book the studio time. And now it's just a matter of going through it and saying, did the AI voice pronounce this properly? Is this word being said the right way? And so you still need someone who can go over it and make sure that it's okay. But the more you train it, the better and better the outcome.
And the other benefit from the AI of that specific function as well is that, okay, great. I go to Trish, I'm like, hey, Trish, I need you to have this person translate this into this language and then do a voiceover. So Trish hires the person, gets the person to do the voiceover work and comes back. By the way, there's 3 words that are just not correct on there. Now you have to wait again for that voiceover artist to get that. Whereas in this tool, I can literally just go over and highlight, or in any of these tools, to be honest, not just this one, I can highlight the word, delete it, change it, rephrase it, and it automatically will update and put it in that phrasing. It also has places where you can put in phrasing. Everything that we do with voiceover, not just simply in Spanish, but also in English, we always obviously tell the customer, here's the ways and the benefits of it, and here's what it sounds like. And with terminology, it has gotten better and better. This is where your LLM, if you have your own internal LLM, you start teaching it those things, you input that information into these other tools, you're able to actually make things highly efficient, very fast, and you're able to produce more content faster as well.
Let me just jump in for a second here. We're not going to talk today about video instructions, but since Aaron showed that, that gets over a lot of the problems on both the language and understandability and pictograms. If you can then supply video instructions. I am planning a webinar later about that, and there's some companies who do those kinds of things with animations or live action, and we'll talk about that. So, but not today.
I'll be very clear. I think that in the next 5 years or so, we'll start seeing decals with animation, and decals that'll be printed digitally, where a person will be able to see video or assets in the decal itself within the next 5 years on pieces of equipment. So I think that could resolve a lot of these problems that we currently have.
Okay, we have 6 minutes. You got more slides to show us, Trish?
Well, I have the upcoming webinars that you have that I can share here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Have you gotten through those slides then?
Oh, let me, honestly, I kind of feel like, well, we didn't touch on a lot of the formatting types of things, but just to I think that we've all talked about, best practices and layout requirements. And honestly, because people are getting away from structure and that sort of thing, that's not even it. As we've said, it all depends on what you have. I have one client that's getting away from Quicksilver and getting into something else. So it just depends on the type of format that you're working with.
Okay.
But yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to
Okay, so
Aaron or to
we'll
me.
take questions in the last 5 minutes, but I'll ask Aaron a question because I'm always interested in this.
Yes.
Simple multi-language manuals, they can be done different ways. You either put the multi-languages on the same page, so the multiple languages there in the translations, or you have basically separate manuals. And the multiple languages on one page drive me crazy because it's so hard to find the English. What do you think is the best way to do that, just from an easy formatting standpoint?
I think it's the audience, the size of the manual, what you're trying to get out. So I'll give you an example. So Ken Cook, we own boat pubs. So if you ever bought a boat in the United States over the last probably 2 decades or so, there's a solid chance the manual that came in there, even if it's got the company brand on it, was probably written and created by us. We own our own digital manuals that we then reprint and repurpose for other companies and stuff like that. The way that we do those manuals is we have a version or a universal version where the book essentially in the print version is everything is one book. It's all printed in one center area, but it's in the we just simply put them all together in one page. But it'll be you go to the language for this is the Spanish section, this is the Italian section, this is how we do it for that book. But I mean, if it's a small, like we've done things for some for products that are tiny, like for toasters and things like that as well. Whereas it's a fold out page, like, and there I don't have a problem with it being right next to each other. So here's the English version, here's the Spanish version, here's the Chinese version, here's the Japanese version, all in the same layout. As long as it is consistent in that formatting, is the way to do it. But the truth is, I don't like printed manuals. I may work for a company that focuses on print, does print. I would prefer a digital manual. The way that we do it for digital manuals is we have a little tool that'll automatically drop down and automatically translate all of them. So then that language would populate right in front of you as if you didn't go to a different page or a different area. It just simply modifies the page. And then we format the layout, make sure it's all in that specific language. That's all takes seconds. And again, a person can then search in that language and all that stuff as well, making it a more functional manual nowadays. But from a printed manual, I think there's lots of options depending on the user. The way that we personally do it is we prefer a separate section in that specific language. And then you go to that tab or that area. And if we're selling in that market, we make that the priority section in that printed book.
Okay, Liz, a question came in about the pros and cons of making instructions available online versus in printed form. That's a nice follow-up to what you were just saying, Aaron. What do you think?
I mean, the cons are, I mean, if you don't have internet, you don't have access to that manual. That's the biggest con, right? So I always tell people a manual still should be printed, especially when it comes to safety, so that person has access to it. So there's no reason why that person doesn't have access to be able to read that information. So if a person's buying a skid steer loader, or if they're buying a dump truck or anything like that, that manual should be physically in that piece of equipment. And I don't even mean like in the dash. Yes, that's another option as well. I mean a physical printed book that a person, where if the machine's down, that nothing's functioning, having that book would be a huge function. And to be honest, Ken, you'd probably give you a better answer. I can tell you that every lawyer that we've ever talked to, they always say having that physical book is the biggest thing from a liability standpoint, but that's what they tell us. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But where am I reading it? I would prefer to read it digitally. I have the ability to update it more frequently. I can also tell you who read it, when they read it, what did they read, and improve the content on it as well. So I would prefer a digital on having it to be able to update, whereas a printed manual, it can be out of date is the problem with that. Some materials just not
Well,
there.
I'll give you the legal take on it because I've advised on this for 40 years now. Well, maybe not 40 years because we haven't done online 40 years. But anyway, yeah, I always have a label on the product that says read the instructions before you use the product. And then I say if the instructions are not available, this is how you can get a new manual. Now today we can send them to the website, or you give them a phone number to call or an email about how to get a manual. So if the company wants to not provide a physical manual with the product, you're not going to guarantee every jury could be different, but I think you just have to give them a good backup, an easy backup, so they can get the manual, get the instructions, because of course, even if you hand them the manual, manuals usually get lost.
Yeah.
So you always want to do that, even whether you have a physical manual or not. So there's a way to do that so that you can make it as easy for them, and then you basically say, I don't have to go any further than that. Now, the jury gets to decide that, not me, but I think if you have a good backup, an easy backup for them to get the instructions and tell them to read them, more often than not, you'll probably be okay. And some of the statutes that are coming out, both in Europe and here, talk about that. I think in Europe it says you don't have to have a physical manual, but you have to have information on the product so they can get the manual if they need it. So now, today's example, I mean, have you ever seen a manual with a computer and a cell phone? No, they don't have physical manuals. So there are products that don't have physical manuals. I think the theory there is you will always, a computer user and a cell phone user will always have online access. So they can always access the instructions. And so that, a dump truck, for example, or, an industrial product used in the field, maybe not. So it depends on the product, but I think you can construct a good argument so that the physical manual is not necessary. But there are certainly very good pros to it in updating the manuals, changing them, making them available. So there are a lot of good things about online manuals.
Yeah.
There is a company that decades ago had manuals that were embedded in an instruction. It was a TV screen that was used with the product, and all you had to do is press on the language, and up popped the manual. So depending on the kind of product you have, there is possible to have multiple languages there electronically.
Yeah, no, I actually think it's great when I sit down in a car or anything like that, and I can literally pull up the instructions, the information directly in the vehicle through like the LCD screen or through the I love that. I love having that presence there. The only thing I can think about is like on those occasions, which unfortunately, since I'm a part of seeing some of these things and working with like groups like the NFDA and things like that as well, like I get to see vehicles and things like that that don't have those things function. Those things aren't working. That's the only time that I want a printed manual. If I don't have like, I'm in an area where I'm in the middle of a field and this thing is here, I have no access to any of those things. Hopefully I have the physical manual. I can quickly reference or pull up something on it if I've never seen it before. That's the only time though. I mean, I'm a big proponent of the digital manual. I want people to use that. It will actually make the manual more functional, more, you can put in embed video, other things like that, instructions that'll give a more clear and concise vision of what you want to try to do. And I think that could be a huge, because you can even go one step farther as now people are starting to embed access to a support person where you hit a button within the actual digital manual and it calls out FaceTime or a chat bot where you can talk to a person or an AI tool that gives you the answer. So I'm a firm believer of that. As quick as you can get the information is the better. But I still think a printed manual, especially on those type of equipment, on a phone, no, I don't need a printed manual. I would prefer, to be honest, to be able to just use the internet on my computer. If something went wrong, I'll go to my computer and just simply pull up the information for it. But on something that's in the middle of a field or in a construction site or something like that, where there may not be internet access, then yeah, I would want a physical print.
Okay,
and I guess sorry, Ken, the consideration too, if it's on screen, there may be character limitations if you have it translated. So that's also another consideration too, with the expansion and the contraction of the text. So sometimes, having it online, you don't have to worry about those limitations with the characters.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much. I think we'll end it right now. We've answered most questions. There was a question about the right to repair and what effect that has on this. I can't answer that. I'm not that familiar with the right to repair that to answer that. So, but in the slides, we will post the slides. I'll post an article that I wrote. If Aaron and Trish have anything additional, easy to post on our website. Take a look at that. And there are email addresses in that last slide, which you can email us questions if you have further questions or need more information about resources that are available in the area. So we appreciate your attendance today. Thank you all very much. Hope you got good information. Again, we will follow this up on the video part of it because I think there's very interesting stuff going on in both animations and live action video that are a good adjunct to what we're going on. And also one other thing is the ANSI standards on warnings have now been adopted. They adopted a new section which does talk about the use of video. So we'll talk about that too. So that'll be for another webinar in the future. So again, thank you all very much. We appreciate your attendance today and hope you found the information useful. And thank you, Aaron and Trish. Thank you for your contributions.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, thank
Yes,
you all.
thank you,
Bye-bye.
Ken.